The presentation that I'm going to do today has to do with how can we think in terms of culture as a source of economic and social value, and in particular, how this perspective can be useful from the point of view of a MED project and more generally as a MED perspective as the one of Sostenuto. In developing this presentation, I will provide some results that have to do with both the research programs that we are carrying out in Milan at the IULM University, which has a specialized faculty, which is called Arts, Markets and Heritage, on this specific area, but also at the same time, some of the policy experiments that we are conducting in several different contexts. For example, at the moment, I'm acting as the head of the bid of Siena for the European Culture Capital 2019. And for example, some of the experiences that I'm going to explain you now are being in this moment experimented in this specific context. So first of all, of course we know a lot, and I will not insist on that, on the direct impacts of culture and creative production. We know this very well, the Figel report and all that. I will not insist on that. The point is that what's extremely overlooked is instead the indirect effects of culture and creative production. And the focus of my presentation today will be on the indirect effects, because as you will see, most of the perception that we have of the opportunities and criticalities of culture is being twisted by the fact that we don't understand these indirect effects. And so in terms of political decision making, one of the reasons why culture is systematically underrepresented in the political agenda has to do with this. So let's consider this in particular. From a European point of view, there seems to be a sort of general agreement that, of course, with some exceptions, we were speaking of Barcelona, for example, or some other cities on the Mediterranean side, but the general perspective seems to be, most of the people that I'm discussing with seem to agree about the fact that Europe seems to be split in two in terms of a cultural participation and production perspective. The Nordic countries are very much focused, also in terms of policy agenda, on culture and creative production, and they have high rates of cultural participation. The Mediterranean countries, on the other hand, tend to be focusing on cultural tourism and have low rates of cultural participation. This is, structurally speaking, a very impressive picture because it's very stable and very consistent through time. This north-south divide could be widening up because, of course, most of the financial crisis today in Europe is concentrated on the Mediterranean side. And so, of course, as a consequence, the most impressive budget cuts are being actually those hitting the Mediterranean side. So it's likely that in the traditional perspective, not only the divide is there, but the divide is going to widen up in the future. And this, of course, is extremely critical. But it would be a big error to dismantle cultural policy as a reflex of economic crisis to save on the cultural budget. And first of all, is very modest. So this is the first irony. For example, in Italy, we are cutting dramatically the budget, and we are preserving a military program in which we are going to spend 15 billion euros for new, for example, military aircrafts. So, I mean, this is clearly a problem from this point of view, but let's try, in Spain, for example, not nominating a Minister of Culture is giving a very clear signal in this respect, for example. So, but how can we counteract this perspective? What kind of action can we undertake? You know, culture is at the root of value creation. I will explain this with a lot of practical examples, practical data in a moment, in unexpected areas. But the very important problem is that decision makers don't realize that. There is a huge gap from this point of view. And exactly in the moments where we need focused investments in culture, cultural budgets are cut. Just to make a comparison, I just briefly tell you about what I'm going to do with my university in China. As you probably know, China is beginning now an extremely ambitious 10-year project on developing the culture and creative industry. Their allocated budget for this is 4,000 billion euros. It's 2.5 times the Italian GDP, just to give you an order of magnitude. One of the first actions that they are undertaking, and fortunately I've been able with my university to manage this, is to create a gigantic executive program for the mayors. because the idea is that if the mayors, who are the real decision makers, don't understand the economics of culture and creative production, what use can it be to launch programs? This is exactly the opposite view with respect to Europe, and this is exactly the structural hole that we have. So if we don't take action on this specific perspective, we can manage wonderful projects, as Sostenuto is. By the way, I've been following it throughout. It's a very interesting project, but still there are many interesting projects like this, but they are going to be extremely peripheral with respect to the actual decision-making game. For example, the long-term European 2020 strategy that is being undertaken now. So there's an urgent need to develop local labs of policy experimentation. And of course, it's extremely important to construct Europe-wide networks of coordinated action. So it's very important that these projects are not ephemeral, that they go on into structural, systematic partnerships with territories that really understand each other, what they want to do, they try to do together in a very consistent way. What can be a possible agenda? I will propose you very quickly an 8 tiers approach to the indirect effect of cultural production and participation. There is evidence now, and by the way, who's interested, in the end I will provide my email address. I can willfully provide a background paper for most of my presentation of today, which by the way has been discussed at the Open Method of Coordination Table, which is the coordination table of the Ministries of Culture and Creative Industries in Brussels. And fortunately, this document has been taken now as an official reference for the next round of structural programming for this. So it's interesting to know that these kind of issues that we are going to discuss here, at least partly, are entering the focus of the decision-making on a specific, concrete action like the structural fund programming, which we know, I mean, for culture is absolutely vital. Today, we don't have the time to discuss all 8 tiers. I will just discuss the first 3, innovation, welfare, and sustainability. But just looking at those, you will see that we have an enormous amount of opportunity and uncharted territory that we have to cope with. So let's begin considering innovation. What you see here is the comparison between 2 different scores. The first one on your left is the innovation scoreboard that measures the innovation performance of EU. In this case, I'm restricting to EU 15 countries because the comparison is more sensible, in terms of innovative capacity. What you see on the right is the ranking in terms of active cultural participation as measured by the Eurobarometer 2007 research that unfortunately has been the only one that has been conducted in this specific field. I really hope that there will be more in the future. And this has to do with something which has nothing to do at all with innovation in the strict sense of the word. It has to do simply with how many citizens, which percentage of citizens in a country in 1 year engage in active cultural participation, by this meaning not simply listening to music but singing or playing an instrument, not simply reading but writing, and so on and so forth. And consider that especially for the generation of digital natives, this is not an exception but a rule, in principle. What you see from this comparison is that interestingly, all and only the countries which are above the EU 27 average on one ranking are also above the average on the other one, and vice versa. Statistically speaking, this is not a coincidence, which technically it means that there is at least a 95% confidence interval that these 2 things have some structural force in common. More interestingly, which are the countries below average? The 5 pigs, first of all, and the 4 Mediterranean countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Greece. So interestingly, there is a relationship between innovation and cultural participation which is totally overlooked and which presents strange, intriguing, structural links to the big problem of policymaking today, financial stability. So what kind of relationship could this be? Why, for example, participation, cultural participation should matter from the point of view of innovation? Can we consider culture as a pre-innovation platform? What you see here is a sculpture by Ron Mueck. It's a famous American sculpture. We could make tons of examples, of course, but what you see from this picture is, of course, the out-of-scale effect, which illustrates very well what I mean by the relationship between cultural participation and pre-innovation. What cultural participation tendentially achieves is stimulating people to force their cognitive presets, to rediscuss their state of mind, their attitude towards ideas which are new, towards experiences which are unfamiliar. What's the game of innovation? The game of innovation is not having some good ideas in a lab. This is only a very tiny part of the game. We know today by the study, the extensive study that has been conducted about innovation systems, that innovation is a social game that engages the whole population, the whole economic systems, and in which you have an extremely high level of structural cooperation between actors who engage in totally different kinds of business, from public administration to banking to technology to retail and so on. So the point is, the more culturally oriented the population, the more this attitude towards the unexpected, this familiarity towards the new, the familiarity with divergent thinking becomes part of your daily experience. And this acts in a tremendous way in terms of innovative competitiveness. If we just measure this particular effect, it's very likely, and by the way, in this moment, my university, which a big network of partners, is bidding for a 7 framework program exactly to do this, to measure the indirect effect of innovation on innovation of cultural participation. And we really expect that this data could change the debate about the role of culture in terms of innovative competitiveness. I mean, if we are able to demonstrate that this is actually the case, then you understand that cutting the cultural budget for participation in a period of crisis is basically shooting your feet. Is dismantling one of the most important social channels that you have to foster innovative attitudes and so competitiveness at a systemic level. So this is the first message. So in terms of impact, I mean, we discuss about impact, the remarkable impact, by the way, of the direct culture and creative production, but what about the indirect one? Only just, I mean, this innovation chapter could make a big difference, but what about welfare? First of all, we know, this is an evidence that has been available now for more or less a decade, that there is a very strong statistical association between life expectancy and cultural participation. A lot of studies conducted in the Nordic countries tell us that more or less there are 2.5 years of extra life expectancy for people who have a systematic cultural access, with respect to people who don't. But the point is not simply length of life. The point is quality of life. So what we are conducting now in Milan, in IULM, in a partnership with Bracco, which is one of the big pharma companies in Italy, and this is a singular cooperation because basically, as you will see, this is a research to demonstrate that we should use less medicines. So having a cooperation with a big pharma company is interesting and nice in some sense. There is a very strong association, not only in terms of life expectancy, but in terms of quality of life. And in particular, we are using an index of quality of life, which is called psychological general well-being. This is an index that ranks between 0 and 110. It has been used consistently for 40 years in clinical practice and is basically measured on the basis of a self-evaluation questionnaire administered to the experimental subjects. And I mean, it's a standard in clinical practice. What we have been doing is to select a representative statistical sample of the Italian population and to administer the questionnaire about psychological general well-being while asking to those people at the same time about their socioeconomic characteristics and their cultural habits. What's the result of this? What's the hierarchy of factors that affects psychological well-being on the basis of this particular research? This is the answer. The most important is the number of chronic diseases that people think they have. And this is not particularly strange or surprising. But the second is the level of cultural participation is more important than income, age, education, gender, job, and geography. And this is what happens at the level of single activities. This is the pattern of evaluation of the psychological general well-being, for example, for classical music concerts. What you see on the left is the level of psychological general well-being. Remember, it ranges between 0 and 110. And you see here that, for example, between people who attend at least one concert per month, more or less, and people who do not attend any concert at all, there is a differential of more than 10 points that for this indicator is an enormous difference, enormous. And in particular, notice the spectacular increase in well-being that is beyond 6 to 10 concerts per year. This is a particular facet, however, of classical music concerts. Not all activities have the same behavior. This is, for example, theater, in which you have a very important increase, by the way, statistically significant, but you also have a plateau. At a certain level, between sensible consumption and very strong consumption, there is not really a difference in terms of psychological well-being. This is the rule. For most activities, this is what happens, by the way. So we are not saying that all people should become culturally obsessed. We are simply saying that people should become substantial consumers, so to speak, of culture, or better, they should incorporate in a substantial way cultural experience into their daily menu of activity. There are, however, also activities which have a negative impact on psychological well-being. One, unsurprisingly, is television, and I don't have to explain why. But the other one is very surprising instead. Probably it's a feature of the Italian sample, we don't know. We will make a special research on that, but it's really a riddle. It's poetry. People who read more than 10 poetry books a year fare much worse than people who don't read any poetry at all. Which probably has to do with Italian poetry, I don't know. Either it is too good or too bad. I leave it to you. But basically this is a riddle, and we are interested to know what happens at the European level. By the way, we are also beginning a European-wide research to replicate this kind of analysis at the European level. And so, for example, it would be extremely interesting, in this specific sense, to create a university network that really goes into deep analysis of this. But what are the implications of this? Reason simply in this way. By the way, first, before looking at the implication, a more technical but impressive aspect. If we further disaggregate in terms of, okay, you can't read it because it's too small, but I explain it. If you further disaggregate and do not reason in terms of general categories, diseases, cultural activities, but you disaggregate into specific variables, cancer, arthritis, diabetes, whatever, or theater, it's strange to make this kind of comparison, but okay, theater, poetry, whatever. So what are, but also income, age, of course, what are the most important single variables in forecasting the actual level of psychological general well-being of one specific person? The factors in yellow are cultural. So you see that in the first 10, 6 of them are cultural, and more specifically, to forecast the specific level of well-being of one person is more important to ask him or her how many jazz concerts he or she attends in 1 year than whether he or she believes to have cancer. Not bad. What's interesting is also the implication in terms of the welfare budget. Because what we are doing now is exactly to conduct clinical trials to understand what's the relationship between cultural access and the hospitalization rate. For example, what is clear is that this kind of effect is particularly spectacular on 2 categories, the elderly and the people with several chronic diseases. When those people make cultural activities, their world changes completely. If this means, and we have reason to believe that this is a very conservative estimate, but if this means that cultural participation brings about a 1% decrease in the welfare bill, we are changing the European macroeconomy, and in particular, we are changing the macroeconomy of culture, because we are financing culture, letting the state save, and improving in a spectacular way the well-being of citizens. If this would be the 5%, this would change completely the strategy, the European strategy of welfare for the next 20 years. So, when we speak of culture of something that does not count in the actual scenario of crisis, we really don't know what we are talking about. The real point is that we don't understand what culture is doing today in bringing about social and economic value. If we manage to incorporate this strategically in the political decision-making, the kind of discourse that we are making and this surreal discourse about cutting culture in periods of crisis would disappear completely. And this is up to us at this point. So can we reason in terms of a cultural welfare perspective? The answer is yes. The well-being impact of cultural participation could really change completely the macroeconomics of welfare. Of course, it will be very difficult for mainstream welfare economists to accept this, but, I mean, there have been so many strange things that have been swallowed in the end. Why not this one? By the way, is a win-win strategy apart from the most conservative sectors of the pharma industry. These are the only losers, but not necessarily, because this would stimulate a completely different way to tackle welfare issues. And by the way, imagine what kind of new professional profiles this could create at the border between health and cultural professions. So, speaking of happiness in Europe, cultural participation and happiness. We made a comparison in terms of innovation, but what about happiness? We could say, okay, we have lower participation rates, but we are happy anyway, so probably cultural participation does not count that much, apart from these strange results that we don't understand completely, but they have been published in a very good journal, so at least this, I mean, is an argument. But the point is that if you just list the 10 happiest countries in EU 15, you'll see that they are all Nordic countries. So probably cultural participation is a problem, also from this point of view. So Med countries also have a real happiness well-being problem. Does this have to do with poor cultural access again? What about sustainability? That's the last one that we consider. What kind of relationship could there be between sustainability and cultural participation? Well, let's consider this example. We have been working again on the representative sample of the Italian population and relating cultural participation to waste recycling behavior. So what's the efficiency of the waste recycling process in specific countries, in terms of individual choices as depicted by the national census. It turns out that there is an extremely strong relationship between cultural access and efficiency of waste recycling, and this is very likely to have to do with two reasons. One is motivational. People who have a larger cultural access are more motivated to do it because they understand the systemic implication of the individual behavior, and this has been tested on a very specific ground. Whether or not people are willing to go the way that is needed to bring the waste to the recycle bin or not. The farther away it is from the house, the most important is cultural participation. So only people who have a substantial level of cultural participation want to go all the way to put the waste in the recycle bin if this is far away from home. The second aspect has to do with classification. People who have a larger cultural access are better at classifying waste, which is a cognitive problem. And in some cases, I mean, all of us are puzzled by this piece of waste, in which bin should I put it? It's very difficult sometimes. And again, this is very important. So, does culture improve recycling? The answer again is yes. And so, what does this mean in terms of, again, the macroeconomic impact, which is totally indirect, which has nothing to do with selling goods or buying cultural goods. It could be totally, amateur activity, totally based on cultural participation. And again, what's the relationship between this and the actual statistics for the Med countries? In these cases, rather than countries, cities make a more interesting example. These are the best 10 EU 15 capital cities for waste management and land use. Again, who's missing? The usual suspects. So what's interesting is that even in this case, Nordic countries have a totally different impact. One could argue, however, the usual objection, but why should culture make the difference? Couldn't it be income? After all, these countries are countries which have a higher income, so probably simply people who earn more are more civilized, so to speak, in all these dimensions. But that's not very likely because you have a lot of counterexamples. First of all, countries like Ireland with a relatively high per capita income, but they perform very poorly in innovation and cultural participation. Cultural access, we have seen it, is more important than income in determining well-being, so why should it be income? I mean, statistically speaking, it doesn't make sense. And again, Madrid and Rome have a higher per capita income than Berlin, but in terms of waste recycling, they are much worse. So, whereas cultural participation reflects the performance on all these dimensions is, however, statistically speaking, very accurately reflected by cultural participation. So if there is a good candidate to be the real causal factor in all this process, it is cultural participation. So to conclude, in a nutshell, we have to begin to consider culture as a social software. It's a social software that makes the whole knowledge-oriented economy and society work better, in motivational terms, in coordination terms, and especially in terms of generation of value. This is a long reasoning, of course, that I don't have the time to develop here, but again, I'll send you, if anyone is interested, I'll send a paper that describes this very accurately. The total indirect macroeconomic impact of cultural participation is really surprising if we are going to measure it, and we will do it now. Once we measure these indirect effects of culture, it could really make a sea change in terms of the structure of the policy agenda. And as Jordi explained before, this is a much needed change at the moment. And of course, these effects are further strengthened by the growth of culture and creative industry per se. But the problem is, we have to make this growth inclusive and participative. If we simply consider culture and creative industry as an industry in the one-sided sense, we are really begging the question. And for example, the crazy debate in the United States about the SOPA Act now are a clear expression of what happens when you reason in this monodimensional view and you don't really understand what's the social impact of culture and creative social circulation of contents. To conclude, what are the lessons for the MED area? First of all, it's a key one for experimentation of innovative models. And why? Because it lags behind. This has always been an opportunity. Now, of course, the problem of the Nordic countries is that they have the winner's curse, so to speak. They've experimented with a model of participation, which is, however, now very sedimented and in some sense traditional. So it's very difficult for them, who have already a very high level of participation, to bring these ideas in the policy agenda. And I can testify directly because I'm working a lot, for example, in Sweden. But there, for example, it's very difficult for the politicians to understand why they should think something that works perfectly as it is in a totally different way. Second, it's very important to construct Medcenter thematic networks. This is really a necessity, and focusing the networks on these innovative issues could really make a difference, not only in terms of acceptance of proposals, but also in terms of policy effectiveness of these proposals. It would be extremely worthwhile, of course, to consider, and I mean, the presentation that we heard before about, of course, the NP program clearly goes in this direction. We have to consider what happens on the other side of the Mediterranean. Those people cannot be excluded by this, because this could be one of the factors that really bring together the African side of the Mediterranean on a knowledge-oriented kind of social transformation rather than the other scenario that we all know and that we all fear. And of course, we don't have to forget Turkey, that in this moment is beginning to be one of the giants of cultural production and participation, especially for the future. So the models should not simply be borrowed by the Nordic experience, but on the contrary, should be very culture-specific and should be tested on the specific ground of the MED area. So this is my email address and my Twitter account. So for any kind of information or feedback, I'm more than welcome. You are more than welcome. Thank you very much.